Now, I feel like I actually didn't do a very good overview of the powers of the federal government versus the state government, so I'm just going to do that real quick. The express powers of the federal government is they can print money, regulate interstate and international trade. They can make treaties. They can conduct foreign policy, declare war, which actually Congress is supposed to declare war, but since we're already in war and there's authorization to use force, Obama is actually allowed to send any troop into any country that he wants to at any time, whenever he feels like it, without telling anybody. The express powers of the federal government, the powers of the federal government is provide an army, provide a navy, print money, regulate interstate, international trade, make treaties, conduct foreign policy, declare war, establish post offices, make laws necessary and proper in order to carry out those powers. Um, those are the express powers, right? The powers of the state government are they are allowed to issue licenses, marriage license, hunting license, driver's license, regulate interstate businesses, so the states within their communities are allowed to regulate, conduct elections. That's up to the states to run elections, establish local governments. That's the state. The state gets to establish how Muldrow's government is established, or Meade County, or Hardin County, or Elizabethtown. All these are local governments, which are they get their power from the state. So the state has all the power, and they delegate it to the local government and to the county governments. Okay, so that's the powers of the state. They get to establish local governments, ratify amendments to the Constitution. That's a state government thing. Take measures for public health and safety. So that's actually important. So there's a wolf pack. They're trying to get money out of politics, and they're going to the states for it. They're going to getting the amendments passed, and the way they get the amendments passed is when the state government passes that amendment. State governments could also just give it to the people, right? Have a referendum and let the people vote on the thing. But the state government itself could ratify Wolfpack.com. I don't know if it's .com. I think I've been watching too much TYT, but the state government can ratify the amendment, and then once I think 3/5 of the amendments or 3/5 of the states ratify the amendment, then it becomes law. So that's let's see, that's a power of the state government to ratify amendments to take measures for public health and safety. And they may exert powers that the Constitution does not delegate to the national government. Okay, establish local governments, issue licenses, regulate interstate commerces, elections, ratify amendments, provide for the public health and safety, exercise powers neither delegated to the national government. So basically anything else, right? So such as legal drinking age and smoking ages, seatbelt laws, whatever, whatever creative and imaginative thing that these state government can come up with. So those are the overall powers of what the state can do versus what the federal government can do. Now, it really comes down to the finer points, because where do they get these rights? Where does it come from? When Kentucky joined the United States, we're the 15th state in 1792. That's when we joined the United States of America, right? Woo, yay, USA, USA. When we join that, we actually give up our right to make treaties with foreign nations. We almost were the Spanish. The Spanish, a colony of the Spanish crown. So we all could have been speaking Spanish at one point. You had James Wilkinson, who owned Frankfurt, or the land that Frankfurt was sitting on, who was a member of the Spanish colonizers of the crown. He was a member of the spy or something of the Spanish crown. And the reason why we almost became a colony of Spain was because they had controlled the Mississippi, and the Mississippi, the Ohio River, we really needed that sort of commerce to sell our goods downriver. So that's a lot of unnecessary information. No, when it comes to the federal and the government thing. So the federal and the government, the specifics, okay, you have express powers, which is Article 1, Section 10 says these are the powers that the U.S. Constitution has. This is what the power of the government, the federal government has. So basically it's a dualistic government. State government's got power, federal government's got power, and they vie for power between each other. But those are the two main entities. The local governments are sort of irrelevant because they get their power from the state government. Now, all of it, all these are representatives that are elected, so therefore they are derived by the consent of the governed, right, because of the elections. And in fact, actually, it almost seems like the elections are some sort of an illusion because you give your power away when only 30% of the public are voting. That it's not really the consent of the governed, it's consent of the majority of the 30% that, so the 16% that vote are actually giving our power away to these, representatives that aren't actually representing anybody but the big corporations or themselves. So, the express powers are the ones that they say this is exactly what we can and can do, okay? This is what the states cannot do because we, the government, can do. So declare war, only the United States of America, only Congress or the president can declare war, but Kentucky cannot declare war on Tennessee. Kentucky can't declare war on Canada. Kentucky can't declare war on drugs. Well, I don't know. They probably can, but they can't declare war on any other nation. Now, that's because of the express powers. Now, there's a thing called implied powers or incidental powers, which is based on the elastic clause. And the elastic clause is compact clause. Okay, actually, the implied powers, I'm going to get to the implied powers, but first I just want to make sure that I covered all the express powers. So there's 3 clauses in Article 1, Section 10, and there's the import-export clause, so only the federal government can issue tariffs. Kentucky cannot tax Tennessee for goods that come in. The interstate, they could drive straight through from Florida all the way up to Michigan without paying no extra taxes or fees crossing into any of the states. That's Clause 2. Clause 3 is the compact clause, which says that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace. So, which is interesting. We can't have a standing army. They're saying that states can't do this. Only the federal government could. We cannot keep troops. We cannot have ships of war in times of peace or enter into any agreement or compact with another state or foreign power. So we can't even get to a contract with Tennessee, which is interesting because I've heard we got a reciprocal agreement, but that's you can't actually have an agreement. It had to come from the Constitution. You can actually sign up for it, which is incredible. Actually, it seems like there would be some things that Tennessee and Kentucky would want to happen along their border. We share a big southern border with Tennessee. So enter into any agreement or compact with any foreign power. We cannot engage in war unless actually invaded. So if Tennessee was to invade Kentucky, then we could declare war. If West Virginia invaded Kentucky, we could declare war. The Hatfield and the McCoys almost became a war type of thing because Hatfield and McCoys was right on the border of West Virginia and Kentucky. And the governors were actually involved in it, and they wanted to stop it. And you had one person from Kentucky that actually went into West Virginia and arrested a whole bunch of people, but then they said it was illegal because they weren't allowed to do it. So they said that was actually an invasion. And if there's an invasion, then you could declare war. That's the only way a state can declare war is if they get invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So if they're being invaded, or if there's a danger of close invasion, I don't know, say China was going to say they was going to drop a nuclear bomb on Kentucky, then Kentucky's going to say, no, we declare war on China. We're not going to wait for the U.S. government to do it. Kentucky's going to go it alone, right? And actually, that's not that surprising. I mean, when you think about like Japan or Cuba or a lot of these small Japan, Cuba, Great Britain, a lot of these small islands which seem like they have we have 4 million people in Kentucky, so a lot of these Cuba, I don't know how many people there are, but I think there's less than 4 million. We definitely have a greater geographical space than these countries, but they were able to, take Cuba for example, they were able to send armies or troops to South Africa during their apartheid fight. So they were fighting against the, apartheid, the segregation of the races. They was going to, all of a sudden, not just be equal or just be free and equal. They sent troops there. Well, how come Kentucky doesn't do anything like that? Why don't we send like manpower over here or over there? Well, we don't ever do anything like that. My point is that these small, tiny states with whatever resources and whatever people that they have seem to be able to do so much more than what Kentucky does when we are capable of doing so much more. We got, vast landscapes, lots of tourist dollars. We could do anything and everything anybody else can do. We need a renaissance in Kentucky, right? We need a regeneration, a cultural regeneration. Now, I don't even know if I'm going to get to the implied powers. But these are the express powers. This is Article 1, Section 10. This is important stuff because this is what the U.S. government is allowed to do. The U.S. government can declare war in general on whoever they want to. They can preemptively declare war on Iraq, and that's fine. But the only way Kentucky could declare war on Iraq is if Iraq was actually to invade us. If we were invaded, then we could declare war, but only, it says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war. So we're not allowed to engage in war unless actually invaded, right? Or until unless imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So those are the express clause. Now those are the powers that the U.S. Constitution says states cannot do because the federal government can. So the states cannot regulate interstate commerce and international commerce or have treaties with other people or declare war, but the U.S. government does. So it denies the power of the states and it takes the government, its exclusive laws of the federal government. Now compare express powers to implied powers, which was the whole point of this video, is to talk about the implied powers. Now implied powers in the United States are those powers authorized by a document from the Constitution which, while not stated, seem to be implied by powers expressly stated. So, for example, George Washington asked Alexander Hamilton to defend the constitutionality of the first Bank of the United States against the protests of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. Alexander Hamilton produced what has now become the classic statement for implied powers. I cannot stand Alexander Hamilton. The whole point of getting a bank, he wanted to establish the bank so that way you could put everybody in debt, and then once you put everybody in debt, then you could start to control them. When you have if you can't, conquer a people, then you can put them in debt, and then once they're in debt, then you conquer them that way. That was the whole point. I can't stand Alexander Hamilton. Aaron Burr is my hero. I'm so glad that duel happened and Alexander Hamilton got shot. But this isn't about my hatred of Alexander Hamilton. He was able to write about the implied powers. And the implied powers, so the United States government, it does not say expressly that the United States government can establish a Bank of the United States. It does say that Congress, the United States, has a right to coin money and to regulate interstate commerce and, coin money, interstate commerce, and something else that's like money, regulate the currency. So they can regulate currency, they can have a common currency for the whole thing, they can print up coins and money for everybody else, but they weren't allowed to have a bank. But George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, they like to play with the Constitution a little bit, right? Do whatever they want to do. George Washington liked killing the Indians too, Native Americans, Miami, Shawnee, Iroquois, basically anybody, any Indians. But the justification for having a bank comes from Alexander Hamilton. So having a bank in the United States is not an express power, but it's an implied power. So Hamilton argued that the sovereign duties of a government implied the right to use means adequate to its ends. Although the United States government was sovereign only as to certain objects, it was impossible to define all means which it should use because it was impossible for the founders to anticipate all future exigencies. So just because it's not included in the express powers of government, the government has a right to protect its people. So therefore, the implied powers, it comes from the general welfare clause and the necessary and proper clause. So there's sort of some elasticity when it comes to that. Now there's also, the idea that how can I coin money and regulate commerce if I don't have a bank? So that's sort of implied power, saying that in order to enforce my express powers, I need to establish a bank so I can have, enforce. So I have to have an implied power to establish a bank to enforce the express powers. Now, although the United States government was sovereign only to certain objects, now this goes to the general welfare clause, so it's not just the idea of enforcing already things that are expressed in it, but the government, the United States government, has a right to protect the general welfare of the people, anything that is necessary and proper in order to do so. That comes from the general welfare clause and the necessary and proper clause, which I'll get to in a second. I got a minute here. But it adds some elasticity to the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton won the argument with George Washington, who signed his bank bill into law. Later, directly borrowing from Alexander Hamilton, Chief Justice John Marshall invoked the implied powers of government in the court decision of McCulloch v. Maryland. This was used to justify the denial of the right of a state to tax a bank, the second bank of the United States, using the idea to argue the constitutionality of the United States Congress creating it in 1816. So some of the states was like, well, we're going to tax your bank, and they was like, well, no, the implied powers of the Constitution allows us to have a bank of the United States, the second bank, right? Do we have a bank today? Yes, it's called the Federal Reserve. So we still have a bank, a national bank, which isn't even owned by the government. I think it's a private entity today because of implied powers.